whenever it
I've
comes
got my
through.
wrist, so that's good.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. We're all good. So we'll kick it off. I'm Seb, and that's Rosie.
Hello, I'm
I'm
Rosie.
sure most of you have met us before, but on the off chance that you have no idea who we are. So I'm going to start this off by we break down what a mutualism is. So mutualism, just as parasitism, is a type of symbiosis, and a symbiosis is the persistent long-term interaction between different species. It kind of sounds boring when you put it like that, but it's basically like two animals living like in very close proximity with their lives being kind of almost intertwined on an evolutionary kind of scale. So parasitism's easy. One organism gains whilst one organism loses. So if you think like the example there, I've given of a mosquito. The mosquito takes some blood. You have a you have a tapeworm. You lose from that, and then the other organism gains. And then a commensalism is when one gains and the other just does not care. So that here being like the example I've given here is some egrets and a ox. The ox just kind of ruffles through the ground. The egrets just eat whatever it chucks up. The ox doesn't gain anything. The ox doesn't care, but the others gain from it. And then mutualisms are when both gain. So if you think of the easiest one, which is why I put it here, is basically pollination. The bee gets the nectar, the plant gets its pollen spread, and it can fertilize that way. Easy enough. So mutualism comes in three forms. We get a resource-resource mutualism, which is basically I give you nutrients, you give me nutrients, or they both get some sort of chemical gain from it. Service resource is like one of them gets a resource in exchange for some form of service. So if you think of like cleaning, one gets the food, one gets cleaned, loses the parasites. And then service is where basically you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So this is like, just kind of like hunting together, the shelter, this kind of thing. So I thought I'd kick that off with a bit of resource. So resource is, they're a little bit difficult and they kind of sound boring on paper. But what it gives you scope to do is to think about this concept of everything being kind of very intertwined. So if you think of yourself and you think, all right, so I'm just kind of like this physical thing. That thing next to me is completely different. I have nothing to do with that. Or you think of like, so I have a tree outside and I have a tree next to it. They're at odds. One, if you think their benefit is not my benefit, if they get more nutrients, I get less, and stuff like that. It kind of falls apart when you look at it more closely. So if you think of like, I think a good example of this is if we think of a disease. So when I was studying for an essay, I came across a conclusion that basically if you think like cholera causes like the cholera disease and you get all of these awful symptoms from it, diseases like that, the current consensus is that it's kind of more of like a community aspect to it. These facilitate others to come in and other microbes to come in, and then this is big community shuts things down. And the lines between individual and community really do dissolve at a small scale. And a brilliant example of this is mycorrhizae. So most trees and plants in the world are connected to each other and connected to fungus in their roots. So these roots on their base level act like an extension of the root, so they can provide an extra surface area, help you assimilate more nutrients than you would have normally. And these can be either endomycorrhizal, which is inside, or ecto, which is outside. I think I've got that right if I remember Latin. But fungus are little excretion machines, so they can like release all of these enzymes and break down stuff that the plants just wouldn't be able to access otherwise. And then the fungus get carbohydrates from the plant in exchange for that at a base level. But where this gets really interesting is when you look at it just a little bit more closely, and you see that 60% of all trees on the planet, which I think I looked at it, and it's like 2 trillion trees or something connected to each other through a network of these fungus. If you think of this as kind of being sort of like the synapses in your brain, all of these different neurons that all connect to one another, and it almost acts like a social network for these trees. They call it the wood wide web, and this kind of, it acts almost like a hive mind. It's such a weird concept, and it's not really that well understood. But there are resources that shift between this. So if you have a dying tree, the network's like, well, he's dead. He doesn't need any nutrients. We're just going to move all of that to these other trees. Or you have like a small tree on the canopy. The network will move a load of these nutrients to these tiny trees and help them grow better. It's so strange. And also, plants can communicate with each other through these as like a true social network. Like plants, if you think of like a plant being like eaten by an insect or something, aphids, they'll release pheromones. But they found out that a much more efficient way that they talk to each other is they just do it through the fungus. And it's just such a strange concept of like communicating through like this network that spreads between all the trees. It's insane. I found this quote from an article I read. Basically, these are 2 different species. One is a pine and one is a birch. And the evergreen pine sends resources to another species, like out of almost altruism. And then it gets the favor returned to it. So not only is it mutualism between the plant and the fungus, the plants are engaging in mutualisms with each other through this network. And it's just utterly insane. I'm reading about it in this book, going to plug it, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. It's insane. But these trees have a social network through the ground. It's insane. Another kind of example like this of something that seems so trivial, but is actually really complicated, is the gut microbiome. So most animals, other than bats for some reason, have a microbiome. And these, again, work in a similar way to these fungi. They break down nutrients that we can't normally access ourselves. And the actual presence of just the sheer number of these stops other like parasitic bacteria and stuff being able to properly colonize. But as well as releasing nutrients, these microbes will release neurotransmitters to give feedback to what we eat. So let's say you have fast food bacteria or whatever, just not that such a thing exists, but bacteria that really likes the nutrients it gets from fast food. You give it fast food, it releases neurotransmitters that go, oh, good job, mate. And then this can give some positive feedback, and the next thing you know, you're obese. It's insane. The gut releases 90% of our serotonin, and serotonin being one of these huge neurotransmitters that like is so engaged in being happy and emotion, and just because of this, it's been linked to anxiety and depression. And again, what they found is that if you take an anxious mouse and you clear all of its gut microbes, it actually can get bolder. Like, you can make a rat less anxious by getting rid of its microbiome. So it does really make you think of kind of quite how much we are in control of our own brain chemistry, when really so much of it is not controlled by us. So yeah, eat your vegetables or your gut microbes will kill you. So the next part of this is the colonial organisms. So this is a Portuguese man of war, which is composed of loads of different animals that all come together to make one. But I didn't put it in here because it's all one species. So this is a classic example, a lichen. If you think of originally lichens were thought to be basically just an algae and a fungus, or a cyanobacteria. So you've got like the fungus is the structure, and the fungus and the algae does the photosynthetic part, and they kind of trade the materials between the two of them. But of course, as you look closely, it is not that. It is so much more. There's so much more going on, and you can have multiple different species all coming together and providing each other with all of these insane like nutrients. Also, it keeps evolving like independently throughout the fungus kingdom. If you think of like how nature just keeps evolving crabs, fungus just keeps evolving into lichen. But Yeah, lichens are estimated to take up 6 to 8% of the world's surface, and they're really great down in Cornwall. But there's been some research into this, and that they think that the benefits of the fungus seem way greater than the algae, because the fungus just kind of does nothing; it just grows and gets its nutrients. So they're thinking, like, is the fungus farming the algae, or is the algae farming the fungus? It seems slightly wonky when you think about it. But that's another thing to think about. And another classic example being coral. So a coral is basically made of these little polyps, these cnidarian polyps. If you think of like an anemone, they're also cnidarians, and they have these dinoflagellates, these tiny little wee beasties inside of them that are photosynthetic. So the zooxanthellae produce the nutrients for the coral, and then the coral gives the structure of lays down its calcium carbonate and stuff like that. And they exchange the nutrients between the two of them. But as the temperature rises, what's happening is that the corals are ditching the dinoflagellates. They're ditching their photosynthetic parts and thinking, oh, this is too hot. It's not beneficial enough for me to keep these dinoflagellates. I'm just going to do it on my own. Usually it doesn't work because this is a proper last-ditch effort. And what this is leading to is coral bleaching. So as you think of global warming and as the temperatures are rising, what's happening is we're ditching the dinoflagellates. Corals are trying to make it on their own, but they just can't do it. And they're dying, and that's what's leading to coral die-offs. I realise I've just talked a mile a minute then, but it's entertaining stuff. So this is the second part. This is a service resource. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory what kind of service is being provided here. You've got the defense of an anemone, and the crab gets to eat stuff. So the first example of this that I wanted to go into is farming, and ants are really great for this. So ants and aphids. An aphid, I think we've all seen aphids. They're little bugs. They bite. They drink the sap of plants, which is basically just pure sugar. So they actually have microbes that produce, their gut microbe produces all of their nutrients for them, which is really cool, or a lot of them. And basically what the ants have realized is that because they like secrete excess sugar as like pure sugar like out of their bums, that they can just drink the sugar and get all of their sugar that way in exchange for just protecting the aphids. So the aphids are protecting them from their predators, from parasitoid wasps, in exchange for food. And what they actually do is they milk them like cattle with their front legs. They kind of squeeze the bum and make them produce more honeydew than they normally would. And they herd them, they move them, they carry them between feeding sites, they build shelters for them, even out of insect exoskeletons sometimes, which is really badass. And they also put down sick aphids. It's slightly less romantic than, kind of like putting down a dog and everything's really nice. They just yeet it off the top of a tree, but they're still kind of, keeping these communities kind of clear of disease. But what this gives rise to, I had to slip some parasitism in here because it's me. But what this gives rise to is ant mimicry. So you get parasitoid wasps pretending to be ants in order to basically just stroll in and parasitize for free all of these aphids. And what this is an example of something called Wasmanian mimicry. I put in a little bit about mimicry here just because I wanted to. So two extra types. If you think of Batesian mimicry, which is the standard, something that's not toxic, pretending to be toxic. And then you have Mullerian mimicry, which is two toxic things pretending to be one another to kind of split this load of being eaten. But you get these other two types that are talked about less. So you get this thing called aggressive mimicry. So if you think of like an anglerfish, this is pretending to be something else. Or orchid mantis, like flower spiders, stuff like that. They camouflage themselves. Something thinks, oh, that's a nice flower, and then they get eaten by a praying mantis. But what you get, slightly more strange, is Wasmanian mimicry, which is this physical or chemical camouflage to disguise yourself as a member of another species. So if you think of they live, it's just kind of pretending to be a member of another species to camouflage yourself among it and just kind of walk among, and you can just get whatever you want done. If you think of like parasites in a beehive, stuff like that. But I digress. So this is another example of farming more ants, but basically leafcutter ants have this sort of fungus that they're cultivating, and they feed it these leaves. They just throw them on a pile, and it gets fermented into by this fungus, and then they eat the fungus. But they clean they clean this fungal mass and get rid of all the gunge on it, and they have these microbes on themselves that help them clean, which are also symbiotic. But the fungus is completely sustained by the ants, and they could just, neither of them could survive without each other. The evolution's gone on for just that long now. But the fungus can release signals that makes the ants change their behavior. And the ants have these bacteria on them that secrete antibiotic chemicals purely just to clean this fungus. It's also kind of insane. Just because there's this other like whole level to the community of there's also bacteria that also live mutualistically with the fungus, and it's just it gets more insane the more you look at it. But there is this thing called the external stomach hypothesis, which is that basically instead of digesting the food themselves, you just get a fungus to do it, and then you just eat the fungus and you get all of the nutrients way easier. You just have to wait a little bit. There's a source for that. Next part, this being defense. More ants again. I decided to get all of the ants out of the way straight away. So acacias are these thorny, kind of bushy things, and they kind of house ants, and then the ants will basically defend the acacia plant. So if something comes along and tries to graze on it, they get a face full of ants, and they just leave it alone. And the acacia like makes little houses for them. It gives them little food packets, stuff like that. And they can stop. I've read accounts of them kind of stopping elephants from grazing. I don't quite know how great that is, but it's the kind of thing. Also, another really cool thing. I was talking earlier on about the plants communicating using pheromones, but they've co-evolved with parasitoid wasps to basically release alarm pheromones. So that when something's getting eaten by some bugs or something, it will release. These plants will release chemicals that attract parasitoid wasps. So you basically you get eaten, you release chemicals, you attract a load of wasps that come in and remove the things that are eating you, and then the wasps get a host. The plant is eaten less. Groovy stuff. And these, I love these crabs. They're like carrier crabs are a big kind of evolutionary thing as well. So these are urchin crabs, and if you could kind of pretty self-explanatory, they're carrying these big spiny sea urchins on their backs in order to reduce the amount of predation, because you're not gonna have a bite of that, are you? And then the urchin gets carried around to new feeding grounds easier and way faster than it can do on its own. Another example of this is the carrier crabs and jellyfish. Basically, they're carrying upside down jellyfish on their back. I don't really know if this is commensalism, because the upside down jellyfish are photosynthetic, so they don't really care. But the crab's just kind of carrying them around with a jellyfish on its back. Another really lovely example are the jeweled anemone crab, and they're a type of hermit crab that carry these anemones around on their back, and the anemones just kind of eat. They get carried around. They get to eat stuff in new places. The crabs sometimes feed them food, and they sting anything that tries to get the crab. So if you think of, you've got a shell and then a load of anemones, so nothing is really going to eat them. And one of my favorites. I love the boxer crab so much. Basically, these crabs attach anemones to their hands. There's a very specific type of anemone that basically only grows on these crabs, or usually only grows on these crabs, and they're actually one of the most toxic anemones that exist, and they're really only found with these crabs. So the crab just kind of does this wafting dance to try and give them more nutrients, and kind of drags them along the floor in exchange for being defended by these.
So You've probably all, this is probably the sort of thing that most of you have heard about. Also, I'm going to apologise. I haven't got as funky animation. I don't know how to do that. So what's really cool about cleaning is it leads to sort of mutualisms that may not occur otherwise. So with the rogue beetle and with mice, this is something that's quite extraordinary, mostly because you don't see mutualisms very frequently between bugs and mammals. Usually mammals eat bugs, sort of thing. So what the rogue beetle does is it lives on the Australian mice fur and removes ectoparasites from it. This is beneficial to the mice as there's less sort of parasitizing going on, but also it means that the beetle has food, and it's quite cool. You jump. You're the one with control, Seb. Thank you. And this is something you can kind of see elsewhere as well, where you have, so with the cleaner shrimp, there's multiple families that all kind of like differently evolved. This is all being sort of evolved each time elsewhere, in which these different families of shrimp will just that they will feed off the mucus and the skin of client fish. And what's kind of cool is that these colourful shrimp, they can't see very well, but they signal to the client fish with their antennae. I couldn't find like GIF or anything, but like they do these antennae wiggles that mean the client fish are less likely to attack them or eat them, especially if their client fish is a predator. So it reduces the fish's aggressive behaviour, and they kind of see that the behaviours adjusted through certain signals that the client fish will give to the shrimp, leading the shrimp to allow it to then clean. And so both, and basically when it comes to signalling, the most important thing is that the signals have to be both beneficial on both sides. So you're getting these very honest signals most of the time coming up with cleaner shrimp and their client fish, which is quite cool. There's also the oxpecker. This is kind of like a contentious issue. Writing too many essays. It's kind of contentious whether or not these are like mutualistic or if they're parasitic. Because so these birds live in sub-Saharan Africa, and their job is, like with the rogue beetles, to pick parasites and dead skin off their hosts. However, they also drink the blood of their hosts when they can, so they'll sit there and they'll clean their host for a bit, and when they think their host is relaxed or a bit chilled out, they will then peck a hole in it and try and drink its blood, or go over to a wound it's got and try and drink its blood. So sort of parasitic, sort of mutualistic. It's kind of, again, contentious, but the client is generally better off for the cleaning afterwards. And then going on to shelter. So it's sort of, again, this is still service resource. So the first one we're going to look at is pitch plants. So pitch plants are usually associated with being very much with being sort of, you know, predatory. They for a plant, they sit there in their traps. However, these pitch plants, what they do is they provide housing for bats. So the bats will they'll fly in and they'll go and sort of sit and live. The hardwick's woolly bat will go and sit and live in this sleep in the pitch plant and be safe. It's a way of getting shelter and safe. And the pitch plant, in response, will collect its feces and use that as a way of gaining the nitrogen it requires to survive. And interestingly enough, these pitch plants have less digestive juices within them compared to their kind of counterparts in other species and stuff, which are more which have evolved to catch insects, because these are getting their nitrogen from the bat. still going on to pitch plants. Not all pitch plants do entirely eat all insects. So there's this really interesting paper that I read, so there's these pitch plants and they have very kind of hollow insides. And for ages, people were thinking that the ants that were living inside the hollow parts of this plant were parasitic. However, there's recently been a paper that contradicts these ideas because the ants are cleaning and removing fungus from the pitch plant, which is allowing it to maintain its self, which means that it's able to catch more insects successfully that aren't ants. In return, it provides shelter for the ant, and sometimes the ants can get away with jumping into the digestive juices and pulling out some of its prey, which is quite cool. And I know I'm talking quite quickly, but so going on from here, you get sentinels. And so sentinels are when you have two different species, and they will basically, I'm wondering if it's in the wrong section, but basically sentinels will kind of alert one another to predators. So, for example, you have mongooses and hornbills. And they're always whenever one of them is foraging, the others will also be foraging with each other. And it's gotten to a point where they can kind of understand each other's signals when alarming the other predator. Yeah, I think this might be in the wrong section. But,
Yeah, it's more service, isn't it?
It's service. It doesn't matter. This.
Yeah, it's just you put it in. It doesn't matter.
I made a mistake. Whoopsie. Similar to before, you also get sentinels such as drogos and meerkats. So what the drogos do is they accompany meerkats around and make and allow for the meerkats to they pick up from the meerkats' alarm calls and can also the meerkats pick up from their alarm calls. However, drogos also will set off false alarm calls every now and again, which cause the meerkats to run away and go and hide, leaving the drogos to go and steal their prey. So again, when you talk about mutualisms, it's always with the knife's edge of if they can get the up on each other, sometimes they will try to. And great tits. So we keep talking about all these exciting environments miles away from here, but sometimes you get these really cool sort of interactions going on in your own back garden. So great tits have a very specific predator alarm call, and generally all of the other garden birds have learnt to acknowledge this as an alarm call. So they can kind of all give off their alarm calls and they all fly away from the sparrowhawk or whatever. However, like with drogos, great tits do take advantage of this and have been known to set off alarm calls in order to get the birdseed out of your feeder with more ease and with less competition.
That's back to me. So yeah, so if you imagine that Rosie's bit was in this section, it doesn't massively matter. So service is I do something for you, you do something for me, basically. So the first part of this is protection of young. So this is a really strange example that I found whilst digging around. These carrion beetles carry these tiny little mites with them, basically all their life on their back. So there are several species of these mite, and basically what they do is that these mites require carrion to reproduce. But of course, because they're mites, they can't just walk along the floor until they find a new carcass. They actually have to get basically taxied there by these beetles. So the corpse beetles find the corpse beetles find the carrion, and then all of these little mites jump off, lay their eggs, and as they're eating the eggs, they also clear the carrion of all of these other eggs that would compete with the carrion beetles. And once they've done that, the beetle larvae pupate right next to the mites, and as soon as the mites hatch, they just jump back on the beetle, and off they go again. And it's also kind of thought that they might have a cleaning role in this. So if you think the service being eating all of the eggs to kind of reduce competition, and the other service being the transport. Another example of this being the rufous woodpecker. So there are accounts of this, but they're quite old. It's one of these things, kind of, if you think of like a crocodile having its teeth pecked, there is a little bit more evidence for this than that. But basically, these rufous woodpeckers are predators of ants. They go into ant colonies, they take a big hole in it and start chunking it. But this was reported that the rufous woodpecker is laying its eggs inside of an ant's nest. So the woodpecker is then thought to switch off, and it's then defending. It's no longer hunting the ants; it's defending this ant colony. And in return, the ants don't eat the chicks. So you've got, like, if you imagine like an ant colony full of ants, and then like just a load of chicks in it that are kind of protected. There's some other animals that sort of almost do similar things. You know, there is evidence for this, but it is slightly. It doesn't quite make sense as much as I want it to be true. But
I'm going to jump in here with fig wasps. So fig wasps are really weird. What they are is, so figs require pollination to be able to produce seeds. And so they'll use wasps to do this for them. The female wasp will burrow themselves into the fig, where she lays eggs and then is just trapped and will just die. And the fig provides like food for the young. But so when she burrows into the fig, she basically can carry can carry sort of like and help with pollination. And in return, the fig will basically provide a food source for her and her offspring as she dies a slow and painful death entrapped inside the fig. It's good fun, must say. And there's a very nice sort of cycle here, because I know I didn't explain that entirely the best way, but where the female just carries the pollen between the figs. Yeah. And there's this one, which is fairly famous because of Pixar. So anemones have these nematocysts, which are fairly kind of nasty. They think sort of jellyfish and anemones. They just tired.
They're the stinging cells, aren't they?
They're the stinging cells. Think jellyfish. They're similar to that. And what they do is they will attack things when they brush past. It's a good way of getting your prey and keeping off predators. However, clownfish have managed to take advantage of this by evolving to be less susceptible to the toxins and to not trigger the anemone. And so what they will do is you will have these clownfish living inside the anemones and within the tentacles, which protects the offspring of the clownfish. And in return, although again a bit service resourcey, they will clean the anemone. But so what's also quite interesting is the two of them. So both the clownfish and the anemone likely share microbiota, and so I think it was fairly obvious. It's hard to explain why they don't sting, but there are definitely some studies that think that the reason that clownfish aren't being attacked by the anemone is to do with the microbiota on the clownfish also being similar enough to the anemone to kind of give it a free pass, which is fairly cool. Yeah. And then we're going into hunting and finding food, which yeah. So this is, so to begin with, you've got your moray eel and your grouper, and they're both predatory fish, and what they also specialize in different areas for hunting, where morays are much more find it easier to hunt in small enclosed spaces, whereas groupers are better off in open water environments, which has led the two of them to start working together. The moray eel will flush prey out of coral reefs where they may think it's safe to hide. And once the fish is out in the open water, the grouper finds it much easier to chase the fish there, and vice versa. The grouper can move the prey into the coral reefs, making it easier for the moray to eat. And this increases the rate of foraging for both the grouper and the moray eel, to the point at which they start kind of hanging around each other whenever they go to hunt, which is kind of cool. It's worth bearing in mind that not all mutualisms are strictly based within your sort of wildlife animals, because humans can benefit from these mutualisms as well. So the honey-guide birds in Zimbabwe are birds that basically fly to bee colonies, and there are people, so honey gatherers, who have learnt to kind of follow these birds to the bee nests, in which they'll open up the nests and take honey from it, which allows the birds to feed on the honeycomb. What's really cool is that the birds come back to these people who gather honey, and they have learnt to be attracted by certain calls of the people in order to go foraging for honey. So they kind of hang out together. And this can all be dated back to sort of the 17th century, potentially further back, but I think that's really cool. On the same sort of note, you get similar sort of mutualisms happening with fishermen dolphins and sort of seals and things as well, where they'll feed off of. I haven't got a slide. It's just
no. I was thinking about, like, where like as you're gardening and there's always that robin following you around. It's kind of a similar thing, isn't it? That's more
except
sometimes commensalism. Yeah,
actively are taking these to, and with dolphins, the dolphins are feeding off the fish, but they can have been known to drive the fish into nets and stuff, which is really cool.
Yeah, I gave a commensalism example of a peasant. Right.
And then there's wolves and ravens, which is like the edgiest example, but I love them. So the common raven's a massive scavenger, and whereas wolves are mainly predators. They will eat like other things, but yeah, they mostly hunt. And so during hunts, ravens keep very, very close to wolves in order to basically benefit from the kills. They'll kind of jump in and try and steal shit. But they're ravens, they're bastards. However, this has led to ravens giving wolves early warning signals of danger, and also early warning signals when prey's been sighted, which has led to this kind of close relationship developing between wolves and ravens, which is really cool. They're really cool. Yeah.
This is me tagging in again. This is a good old fat-tailed scorpion. They engage in some. So defense is mainly like they're all fairly similar. These ones, it's all kind of.
You've just muted yourself, Seb.
Oh right, okay, I'm done. Basically, yeah, they're all fairly similar, these ones, but this is one of my favorite ones. I love this so much. Basically, this is the Colombian lesser black tarantula and the dotted humming frog. Not only does this frog look like exactly like I want a frog to look like, this relationship is just so good. So basically, they live natively in Peru, and they're a similar species in India and Sri Lanka as well. And basically, what happens is these little frogs, they live in the burrows of these giant tarantulas. And the frogs, they eat the tiny invertebrates that will eat the tarantula eggs. So, like ants are the main kind of predator of these eggs. Because like a tarantula like that, what business has he got eating ants? He's just so colossal that it's kind of, or she's colossal that it doesn't quite make sense for her to do that. Also worth noting that these tarantulas live in they live with their offspring. They live with the tarantula, the small tarantulas. Forgot what they're called, spiderlings. Sorry. And the tarantulas let the frog shelter in the burrow and protect them from other predators. Like if you're a snake, you're not going to go anywhere near this tarantula nest. Also worth noting that these tarantulas actually eat frogs. That they leave these little ones because they're not really harm to anyone, and they're not going to eat any spiderlings. If you look down here, that's the size of the frog compared to just the spiderlings. Here as well, spiderling and the frog. But there's a few interesting things. The tarantulas have been shown to kind of, that when they're little, they think, oh, there's a frog, look, I can eat that, and they kind of pick up the frog with their front legs and just kind of move the frog around, nibble it a bit, figure out that they can't eat it, and then just leave it, which is a hilarious visual, to be honest. But the frog's just kind of unfazed. It's getting like nibbled at by loads of spiders. I'm just going to show this image again because I just love it. It kind of reminds me of this meme. I was texting Rosie about it earlier. But another example of this kind of thing is between gobies and a pistol shrimp. So there are like over 100 species of goby that interact with pistol shrimps in this way. But basically, the shrimps dig these big burrows, big enough for the goby and for the shrimp. And as they do so, they chuck up like little inverts that the goby can eat. The goby, but the shrimp have really, really crap eyesight, and the gobies have pretty good eyesight for their size. So the gobies are basically the lookout, and the shrimps are just basically the ones getting the food. What the goby does is it kind of when the shrimp is out of the water, out of the burrow, it kind of rests its back tail, the back of its tail fin on the shrimp. You can see it here, and basically gives it a little bap when they're not safe, and they both go back in the burrow. It's kind of quite cute that they kind of just pressed against each other for the whole time.
They were roommates.
Yeah. Another example of this is slightly more one-way mutualism, but basically these screech owls in America, they'll hunt usually for kind of small reptiles and mice and stuff. And what they do is they get these American blind snakes that are basically completely unwilling, and when they're out foraging, and just grab them and bring them back to the nest, and then just drop them in the thing, and these then snakes just go out and they burrow into the detritus in the nest because they live in trees, and then they eat all of these little invertebrates that would infest the chicks, and they both increase their survival rates this way. So yeah, that's our last example. But thanks for everyone for coming. We open up the floor for some questions if anybody's got any.
Throw some stuff at us.
How do you think these relationships establish? Like the ones that are the woodpecker and the ants. How did that start? Because that is like. Yeah,
but this is the thing with why some of these seem kind of. Oh, I'm going to go miles back, aren't I? But stuff like that, it kind of seems slightly harder to evolve, which is why I come at that kind of thing with a little bit more skepticism. I feel like if you like visualize some of the easier stuff, it's like the Moray and the grouper probably was just by chance, and then you have I think Rosie could probably talk about it a bit more, where you can kind of pass down information that you've learned to your offspring, and you think,
So-
hey, yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to jump in with So part of it might be with like the gut, but the gut bacteria and stuff like that are probably going to be coming from an evolved perspective. However, some of them may be coming from a learnt. And there's always this kind of balance between whether something is learnt or whether it's genetic. So with, for example, wolves and ravens, that is probably learnt. Same with the sentinel stuff and things like that. However, when it comes to potentially more genetic things, like with lichens, I guess, that is very much more likely going to be
co-evolution.
Yeah.
You start small and then slowly become more dependent on one another until, millions of years later, you're completely inseparable. And then you become...
that said, you can get, potentially, if you have these relationships where it's learnt, what you might get is where it may be easier for those relationships to work better if communication's more streamlined. So, for example, humans and dogs have basically co-evolved for thousands of years to the point at which we can kind of understand what they're saying, and to the point at which they can kind of understand us. There are many papers on them getting dopamine rushes and stuff from making eye contact with their owners, which is adorable. And they have like their muscles around like their sort of eyebrows, where which wolves don't have or are less sort of there, and which has allowed them to do the kind of thing that makes them look very cute in order to get humans to work with them better and signal better. So there is definitely co-evolution in both, but dog example.
No, that was really cool. I liked it.
So cool. Like I love the kind of the co-evolution between dogs and humans. It's just where it's at. That and cats as well. Which is pretty cool. Yeah.
No one else got any questions? Right then, I shall end the recording.
Mm-hmm.